Being the first handheld game in the Legend of Zelda series, Link's Awakening was originally released for the Nintendo Game Boy in the summer of 1993, eventually releasing as an equally well-received colorized version for the Game Boy Color in 1998, known as Link's Awakening DX. Much more recently, Link's Awakening received an extensive high-definition remake for the Nintendo Switch, which sold over 6 million copies following its highly anticipated 2019 release. Jumping back to the beginning though, before Link's Awakening was even an idea, Nintendo programmer Katsuaki Moriya created a Zelda-like project on a Game Boy development kit in order to test the console's capabilities. Even as an off-the-record side project, several other Nintendo developers joined in to work after hours as this project began to look more promising as many employees at Nintendo began to see what the Game Boy was really capable of. After the release of A Link to the Past for the Super Nintendo, Zelda co-creator and director Takashi Tezuka was granted permission to create a handheld Zelda title. Though the officially sanctioned project began as a port of the aforementioned Super Nintendo title, Tezuka wanted Link's Awakening to be considered a spin-off, avoiding the use of common elements in the series such as the Triforce and Princess Zelda herself, in order to create a mysterious small-town atmosphere inspired by the TV show Twin Peaks. Since the project that became Link's Awakening began with such leisurely and ambiguous roots, several other Nintendo characters actually made unsanctioned cameo appearances in the final game. These characters include Yoshi and Kirby, as well as Mario characters such as the Goomba and Chain Chomp. The colorized DX version featured new dialogue, Game Boy printer compatibility, and a completely new color-based dungeon, the completion of which awarded the player with one of two possible new permanent upgrades. Upon release, Link's Awakening topped the sales charts in both Japan and the United States, boosting Game Boy console sales by 13% and remaining on bestseller lists for upwards of 90 months. The original Game Boy version of the game sold over 3.8 million copies, with the color version contributing another 2.2 million. You may come to realize just how impressive this game was for its time, and still is to this day, as we discuss what's so great about The Legend of Zelda: Link's Awakening. Following the events of the previously released Zelda game, A Link to the Past, our hero is returning to Hyrule following a quest for personal enlightenment when his ship is caught in a nasty storm. After crashing into darkness as his ship is destroyed, our hero awakens to someone he mistakes for Princess Zelda, though is actually a girl named Marin, an inhabitant of Koholint Island, where this game's adventure takes place. In fact, Link's Awakening is one of the only Zelda games not to take place within some iteration of Hyrule. The opening cutscene is more elaborate than most that could be found in the handheld's library. In fact, saying the game has an opening cutscene at all puts this title in a certain league of quality of its own. It feels similar to seeing the opening of Ninja Gaiden on the NES compared to most titles of its day, which often went straight from nothing to title screen to gameplay. As the player gains control of our hero, who we'll also just refer to as the usual moniker of Link, he wakes up in the house of Marin and Terran, who give us our shield and guide us south to the beach where we washed up. After recovering his sword, Link is greeted by a talking owl who mentions that our hero's arrival has caused this island's monsters to stir. He also explains that if we wish to leave the island and return to Hyrule, then we'll have to wake a creature known as the Windfish. Other than this mission, we're told little else as to what we're really doing on Koholint Island. To awaken the Windfish, the player has to collect 8 magic instruments from each of the island's dungeons, guarded each by an enemy known as a Nightmare. The owl continues to guide us with directions after each dungeon is completed, so the player knows at least which section of the world they should explore in order to progress through the main storyline. Each of the game's dungeons are presented with a little title card and level number upon entering, following a strictly planned order for the player's adventure. The dungeons feel very similar in structure to those found in A Link to the Past, though with much smaller puzzles in each room due to limited space. After the mini-boss of each dungeon is defeated, a portal will open, connecting that boss's room to the dungeon entrance, establishing a shortcut should the player lose all of their health or have to leave the dungeon for some reason. The ever-present compass treasure was given a new feature in this entry, now emitting a chime as the player enters a dungeon room where a key is hidden, giving players an auditory clue in the presence of secrets to compensate for the handheld's limited display. Unlike the first few Zelda games, the hero's shield is now its own separately equipable item, leaving players defenseless when their tool slots are already filled. The shield can be used to bump away malicious enemies, as well as push physically dangerous foes without taking damage. A few mechanics, such as dashing with the Pegasus boots and swimming with the flippers, have been adopted from A Link to the Past's massive update to the general structure of Zelda games. The flippers are one of the few passive upgrades in this game, allowing the player to swim in deep water and briefly dive as well, just as was possible on Super Nintendo. Following Zelda 2 on the NES, this is one of the only Zelda games to have side-scrolling segments, as well as one of the few to have a jumping command. The Rock's Feather, which allows Link to jump over small gaps when equipped, is a great early upgrade for players after it's collected in the first dungeon. The feather's usefulness is quickly demonstrated by granting the player more maneuverability than has been featured in most Zelda games up to this point, as well as a new way to dodge enemies, collect items, and approach obstacles. By combining the dashing capabilities of the Pegasus boots and the jumping ability of the Rock's Feather, the player is able to clear gaps up to 3 tiles wide, making certain puzzles finally possible and opening up more of the world to the player. Throughout Link's Awakening, there's quite a bit of fourth wall breaking in order to make things easier on players that may only pick up this game for small stints with long periods between, which could often have been the case when playing on the portable Game Boy. Characters will explain game mechanics in a tongue-in-cheek manner or advise the player in ways that may seem heavy-handed, but are also a bit funny to smooth out the confusing back-and-forth structure of running errands all around Koholint Island. Very surprising for an adventure of this era, and a small portable one at that, is the inclusion of optional side quests and entertainment outside of the main storyline. Alongside the general 8-dungeon structure that has remained standard since the series premiere, Link's Awakening features a secondary quest in which the player must trade their way through various items among many of the island's inhabitants, depending on whatever problems they're currently facing. This aspect of the game was inspired by the Japanese folktale of the Straw Millionaire, in which a peasant manages to trade his way from a single piece of straw through items of higher value, such as oranges and a silk cloth, until he finally amasses great financial wealth. The trading quest in Link's Awakening gives players more reason to remember who they have and have not talked to, which didn't always matter in a Zelda game, possibly outside of some instances in The Adventure of Link. And while some people gave or sold the player items in A Link to the Past, the majority of the world's inhabitants were, reasonably enough, just included for world building. Speaking to the other inhabitants of Koholint Island is much more imperative to the player's progression, and always having one item that someone on the island is looking for gives players a constant reminder of their current mission and a clue as to who may send them on the next leg of this relay race. Certain points in the main story also won't become activated or accessible until the player has completed a certain number of trades. For the sake of navigation, players can always access an overhead map of the entire island, just as they could in A Link to the Past. However, unexplored areas will remain obscured until the player has reached them. Whenever a new screen has been reached in the overworld, its tile on the map will be filled in, and the player can click on it for a brief description of what's in that square. The map may also show a few objective-based icons to direct the player to points of interest that will keep the game running smoothly. Despite the limitations of the hardware on which it was running, the world within Link's Awakening feels just as diverse and expansive as any Zelda game had achieved on home consoles at that point. Despite being much more compact, Koholint Island is just as interesting and cohesive as Hyrule had been in A Link to the Past. While I wish each major environment could have been more than 8 or so screens large, every unique section of the world is impressively designed to fit snugly together in a tight space, but to do so while still conveying diverse geography for each biome on the island, from forests and swamps to rocky capes and high mountaintops that overlook the ocean. The presentation of the overworld features some of the same polish featured in A Link to the Past, with bouncing flowers and butterflies in grassy areas, as well as glowing torches in caves and crashing waves on the beach. The texture on the ground is also nicely varied to better define each environment, with small specks of sand on Taranbo shores and fallen leaves in the mysterious woods. Whenever the player steps into a tall patch of grass, instead of the tile on the ground changing, the player's sprite actually changes to display Link obscured by tall grass as a workaround to the Game Boy's limited layers. In the DX version, each section of Koholint Island features slightly different shades of grass and water to help the player differentiate and memorize each area, but they also established one of the most varied worlds we had seen in a handheld game at this point, thanks to the more than 32,000 colors accessible in the palette of the Game Boy Color, compared to the 4 monochromatic shades of its predecessor. For every great quality that the original Game Boy version displayed, the DX version released for the Game Boy Color gave audiences, whether they had played the original release or not, a vibrant and reinvigorated chance to experience this on-the-go adventure. With the addition of up to 56 colors on screen at a time, everything in the DX edition is much more clearly defined, allowing the player to much more quickly discern details and threats screen by screen, as well as understand information on maps and menu screens without practically having to squint to discern between 4 undersaturated hues of green on the original Game Boy. The soft pastel palette chosen for Koholint Island is both extremely pleasant and very clear. The addition of color made some puzzles much more understandable now that the player didn't have to scan for tiny differences in the pattern on the ground just to figure out where a block should be pushed or that the floor might give out for under them in that spot. Dungeon rooms that utilize darkness are much better presented and much easier to understand. Similarly, shallow and deep water are much more easily recognized for the sake of secret finding once the player learns to both swim and dive. The DX version also has a slightly more pleasant menu screen overall with much clearer presentation of items, though also features a little pop-up window for convenient information like number of heart pieces collected. Despite the game's much smaller world than was featured in A Link to the Past, it feels more as though something interesting happens or exists in each area without as much wandering between. That's not to say that Hyrule on the Super Nintendo felt blank or empty, but for instance, Link's Awakening features far more unique one-on-one character interactions, especially thanks to the trading quest, and cutscenes take place within the context of the story whenever the character activates them, rather than just a way to drop some more plot at the end of a chapter. Even by the end of this handheld console's lifespan, Link's Awakening was one of the only substantially lengthy adventures on the Game Boy at all. Outside of a couple Final Fantasy titles and replayable puzzle games like Tetris, most platformers, action games, and adventures on the Game Boy actually took very little time to play through front to back, even with popular titles such as Metroid 2 clocking in at about 5 hours, and the first Kirby game taking under a single hour to complete. Eventually, Link's Awakening would be outshone by the first generation of Pokemon, but that wouldn't be for another 5 years. One of the only features of this game that critics have regularly reprimanded would be the control scheme, requiring the player to switch out 1 or 2 items nearly every screen in order to compensate for the 2-button inputs of the Game Boy. And while the restriction of only using the A and B buttons can become cumbersome at times, it's also used to create interesting and challenging puzzles by requiring the player to combine their tools and abilities in creative ways. Longtime Zelda director and producer Eiji Aonuma has stated that he considers Link's Awakening to be the quintessential isometric Zelda game, and that without this side project's release as the 4th mainline entry in the franchise, Ocarina of Time would have been very different. There are actually a few ideas in Link's Awakening that feel as if they were workshopped into or otherwise inspired some notable mechanics in Ocarina of Time 5 years later. These include learning magical songs for the ocarina from characters around the game's world, a dungeon in the middle of a lake that you would have to dive to enter, a magnifying glass that reveals the invisible, as well as a few recurring thematic ideas. Link's Awakening is also recognized as being the first Zelda game with a proper plot as well, with intelligible dialogue that moves the story along, rather than some blurb in a manual that was only included to explain the setting to the player, or long-winded orders that direct you to your next objective after the completion of a dungeon. The 2019 remaster of Link's Awakening on the Nintendo Switch was also very well received, garnering critical recognition for its artistic redesign and faithfully adapted gameplay that led the release to being one of the best-selling titles on the Switch, with over 6.5 million copies sold by December of 2022. While its original version was positively received at release, this is one of those easily overlooked entries in one of Nintendo's biggest flagship franchises nonetheless, that has become a thoroughly beloved classic by those who remember it, aging well enough to be one of the only obvious go-to Game Boy games still worth playing in its original form, long after the hardware had become obsolete. That is what's so great about The Legend of Zelda: Link's Awakening. Thank you all for joining us on this episode of What's So Great About Gaming, as we ran through the qualities of The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening. If you want to support the channel, make sure to like, subscribe, ring the bell, and do whatever else the algorithm demands of us to keep up with our favorite content. Also, consider being a part of the community on Discord, Twitch, or Patreon. If you want to hear what's great about another game, check out the link to our last episode, Super Mario Bros. 3, on screen or in the description. And let us know your thoughts on Link's Awakening and what games you'd like to see in the future. Thanks again for watching. Now go play a great game. We'll see you next time.